this is Matt Welsh with Spiritual Media Blog, and tonight I have a very special guest, Dawson Church. Dawson is a best-selling science writer and the author of 3 award-winning books. The Genie in Your Genes broke new ground by showing that gene expression is influenced by emotions. Mind to Matter is based on hundreds of studies showing that our brains play a key role in constructing the reality around us. In Bliss Brain, he demonstrates that as we cultivate peak states, our brains rapidly rewire themselves for happiness. He is also the founder of the Veterans Stress Solution, which has offered free PTSD treatment to over 22,000 veterans. After retiring from active business management, Dawson has continued to teach and inspire through his presentations, podcasts, books, and blog posts. Dawson, thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Matt, it's a huge pleasure and I love sharing, so I'm looking forward to it.
Great. Well, to get started, tell us about your most recent book, The Bliss Brain. For people who aren't familiar with your work, what's that about? Why did you write it?
I have been studying human suffering and paths to release it for many decades now. And for about 20 years, I did a long-term research project where I was involved with many clinical trials of people with PTSD. And some of those people were refugees, some of them were victims of the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. Others were Haitians who had been caught up in the earthquake there in 2010. Others were Vietnam veterans, and more recently, Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans in the US. And I had just been incredibly motivated by the suffering of people who go through traumatic events and how we can release that. And Matt, a friend of mine was saying to me the other day, Dawson, nowadays we have these wonderful tools. We have energy medicine, we have acupressure, we have meditation to release a lot of the trauma that we encounter in our own lives. My parents, this friend of mine was saying, my parents didn't have any of that stuff. They just suffered. And so I've been so thrilled to see the veteran who, for example, has nightmares and flashbacks and intrusive
Mhm.
thoughts, and then you do some sessions of energy work with that person, and suddenly those symptoms just go away. And then running
Mhm.
clinical trials and seeing them go away. But then in my recent life, I encountered a life-changing tragedy, which is when my house burned down in one of the Northern California wildfires. And it was really sudden. It was the middle of the night. My wife shook me awake. I dashed outside. This wildfire was sweeping toward our house. We just barely had time to grab our car keys, throw on some clothes, and run out to the car while trees were exploding. And it was just a nightmare. And we lost everything. We lost our home, all our possessions. Many of our neighbors died. Over 5,000 houses were destroyed that day. It was just a shattering experience. And we were very affected by it. I mean, we were part of this like mass traumatic stress in the whole of Northern California. And we needed to call upon meditation, energy therapies, psychotherapy, our spiritual practices, all of those things ourselves and apply them to ourselves. But in the year after the fire was in 2017. And in 2018, we were living in a rented house. We had a lot of borrowed furniture, and we just began to put our lives back together again a little bit a few months after the fire. And I realized that every morning I'd meditate, including the day after the fire, when I'd lost everything. I'd meditate in the morning and I'd be in absolute bliss. And I would
Mm.
think, what's going on there? In fact, in one business meeting when just had a big setback in our business, one of my team members said to me, Dawson, you're so unrealistic. Here we are, the business is going to hell in a handbasket. And here you are sitting there in this elevated state. Like, do you fail to realize the seriousness of the situation? And it's not like you're deluding yourself or you're in a sense of denial about what's going on. But when you have meditation, when you have energy therapies, when you have community, when you have love, when you have your spiritual practice, you are anchored in a reality that's greater than your local, immediate circumstances. And I wrote Bliss Brain to try and explain the neuroscience of this, how it works in the brain to be able to lose everything and then still have this sense of wonder and love and awe
Mhm.
and joy about life every single day, and how possible it is with the spiritual practices. So that's the most recent thing that really shaped my life and my work and motivated me to write the book Bliss Brain.
Well, thank you for sharing all that. There's a lot to unpack there, so I'm excited to dive in. To start off, just kind of with the basics, what type of meditation practice do you use, and what type of meditation practice do you recommend other people to use to tap into that bliss brain or that area that's beyond our rational or logical thinking?
That's a really good question, Matt, because there are so many kinds of meditation out there.
Right.
When I was 15 years old, I learned the kind of meditation where you sit quietly, close your eyes, and you try and release your thoughts. And that never worked for me,
Yeah.
and it doesn't work for most people. And so in Bliss Brain, I brought the lens of neuroscience to bear on that question. And I looked at over 400 studies, many of them using MRIs, and seeing what happens in the brains of meditators. And there are really only a few things that move the needle scientifically in meditation. And a lot of what I learned in meditation is actually, it's not just useless, not just doesn't work. It actually is counterproductive because you
Hmm.
try it. Like the meditation teacher I learned it from at 15 said, just close your eyes and still your mind. It's
Right.
like, okay, the eyes closed part, I can do that. The other half, the other 50% of the equation, still your mind.
Yeah. Yeah.
And today I've been meditating for over 50 years every day, and I still can't still my mind. So
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
yeah,
Thank you.
our
Yeah.
minds are designed for that. So see, you have to use a science-based meditation, evidence-based meditation, but there's so much MRI research now that shows us what is effective. And so I have people do practices that are based in science and that are body based. Body based is absolutely vital. Things that are mentally based are not that useful at calming the emotions. I mean, you try, like you say, let's not think about that negative thought. Let's not think about that negative thing I'm obsessing about. Let's sit here and meditate and think positive thoughts. And right away, it's like saying, don't think about a pink elephant. All you
Right.
can think about is pink elephants after that. So that kind of instruction does not work. You need body-based instructions. And so I use a combination of acupressure, pressure on acupuncture points, and that regulates the body's energy system. And there's tons of research on that. I also use the quick coherence technique from Heart Math to
Yeah.
regulate heart rate variability. I use mindfulness. I use some biofeedback, neurofeedback techniques that are drawn from polyvagal theory. And when you stack all those things on top of the other, you get into this very, very deep state involuntarily because you're telling your body to be calm but relaxed. And so that's what you have to do. You have to use a science-based technique.
Yeah. I'm familiar with a lot of those. Those are great, especially the heart math. I use that, and that's awesome. Um, so then I'm curious too how you apply this with people who have experienced trauma and PTSD. Did I hear you say that you've used this and it's gotten rid of their nightmares?
Nightmares, flashbacks, and the other characteristics of PTSD, intrusive thoughts, dysfunctional associations, hypervigilance. There are clusters of symptoms that
Mm.
psychology defines. And yeah, my first focus was on reducing PTSD symptoms. And so
Right.
that was all the research on how to do that. And the main tool I use is tapping on acupuncture points, just like I'm doing right now. You tap on your acupuncture points, and there are 8 of them that are key. You tap on those. And like one veteran I worked with had this fear, and I was working with him actually in a an office building, and somebody walked by as I was working with this guy who'd been in Iraq and served 4 tours of duty there, and somebody walked by and they crinkled a water bottle,
Yeah.
and you hear this crinkling sound of the water bottle, this crackling sound, and this young Iraq veteran was so triggered he wanted to dive under the desk because this sound triggered him so much. 30
Sure.
minutes later, after tapping, completely no response to that very same sound of the crinkling water bottle he had been terrified and panicked about before. So that is really useful in that initial phase of releasing stress, is to use acupressure and then to remove those PTSD symptoms. But then you need to do more than just escape the drag of your past childhood and adult traumas. You have to learn to move into elevated states. And there are these other techniques drawn largely from Tibetan Buddhism that help you move into those states. And then you're not just um, at this baseline of trying to get rid of trauma, you're then moving into this conscious connection with the all that is, with cosmic consciousness,
Okay.
with a reality beyond your everyday reality. And that's what the mystics have been doing and then recommending everyone do for the last many, many thousands of years.
So yeah, I want to hear more about that concept of oneness and spiritual intelligence. But I am also just curious, how do you think that works to help them eliminate the nightmares? Because I'm a licensed psychologist. I've worked with veterans too, and I'm pretty effective at getting them to regulate their nervous system through biofeedback or meditation. But oftentimes the nightmares, they still come back unless I do some sort of exposure therapy. How do you think the work that you're doing is helping them to release that nightmares when they go to sleep?
We really do it in two parts, and the trauma releases first. We don't have people try and hit those peak states until they first have cleared trauma. And so nightmares are dreams are a way the brain has of processing information in real life situations, but symbolically in sleep. And most of our night is spent in deep sleep. Our brains slow down to a cycle of 4 or 3 firings per second. So very, very slow brain firing pattern in delta. And then every hour and a half or so, they speed up into theta waves, a little bit faster waves. And there we have vivid dreams. And in those dreams, symbolically, we're trying to resolve issues that we have in our real life. And so the brain has this way of processing those traumas. What happens with people who are traumatized is they get stuck in a loop and they aren't able to resolve them. They keep going back to the same nightmares over and over and over again. And what we do with tapping, with EFT tapping on acupressure points,
Hmm.
is we're focused on releasing those events. And so, unlike other kinds of therapies that help people cope, that give them mechanisms to counteract their thoughts, EFT is really paradoxical. We actually have people remember the worst things in their lives. Now, again, they're under the care of a therapist or a coach or a qualified trained person, but we have them remember those while they tap. And just like that young veteran, we break the association between the memory of what happened and
Yes.
going into fight or flight. When we do that one time, all kinds of symptoms shift in their bodies. We find their cortisol goes down by an average of 40%. So they're having an enormous drop in biochemical functioning when they do that. We've even found in one study of these little molecules called microRNAs that attach themselves to certain strands of DNA and suppress their function. And for people who are immunocompromised, for people who have high inflammation, they have these little like little molecules, these markers that are attached to the DNA. And these are epigenetic tags that
Okay.
suppress the function of their immune system and and they promote inflammation. And we find that in our research, when they tap and use EFT, those little microRNAs literally fly off the genome and
Wow.
they are restored to effective gene expression. So that happens in sessions with veterans. And after that, their insomnia drops. The average result in our insomnia measures in research with veterans with clinical levels of PTSD is 60% improvement
Wow.
in those symptoms. So they don't get quite back down quite to the normal level. They go from high clinical insomnia to below the clinical cutoff. And again, we're having them focus on the worst stuff of their lives, but they're interrupting fight or flight with the tapping. And we see, for example, the brain structures in the limbic system that process fear get quiet when they tap, and then they no longer are doing that trauma loop processing in their emotional midbrain when they're asleep and the nightmares go away.
That sounds like really great work. So yeah, thanks for sharing a little bit more about that detail. And one thing I like about your work is it really combines the science and the spiritual. So maybe let's build off some of that science and then go to the spiritual. I mean, what are some of your other scientific findings that you've found in general about how meditation or some of these techniques can affect our brain and our body?
I have a new book coming out next year called Spiritual Intelligence, and it's actually up on Amazon right now, but it won't be available for about a year. But I'm looking at this whole phenomenon called spiritual intelligence and what it is, analyzing it, looking at all of the research into it. And this book, I looked at probably over 1,000 studies, and I cite around 500 of them in the book. And what we find is really interesting in terms of brain science, and that is that depression, clinical depression, like major depressive disorder, and spirituality, transcendent, self-transcendent experiences of loving oneness with the universe are mediated by the same brain regions.
Huh.
And one researcher said that depression and spirituality are two sides of the same coin. For example, in teen studies, and these are done by a friend and colleague called Lisa Miller. In teen studies, she finds that teens who identify as spiritual are much less likely to be depressed. And if they do get depressed, will bounce back from it really quickly than those that are identified as not spiritual. So not being spiritual carries much higher risk for teens of being depressed than being spiritual. In adults, we see that a robust spiritual life is protective against cancer and heart disease and diabetes and all kinds of adult diseases. So spirituality and depression, mood and spirituality are like a teeter-totter. They are an inverse relationship to each other. As you meditate, as you act compassionately, as you laugh and have a light and joyful life, all of those things are having profound effects on your health. And then over time, they affect your health chronically, and they determine your longevity. Now, determine your longevity. That's a very strong statement to make. But in studies of optimists, for example, comparing them to pessimists, people who are optimistic in gigantic epidemiological studies involving tens of thousands of people over decades, an optimistic outlook is likely to add around 10 years to your life.
Wow.
Pessimism literally kills you 10 years earlier. So these intrusive thoughts, these nightmares, these beliefs you have, these worldviews are not innocuous. Have positive ones, they're going to boost your health, boost your lifespan, have negative ones, and they're going to rob you of those years. You can be traveling, playing with your grandkids, doing whatever it is you want to do after you finish your working cycle. But there is a massive cost to negative thinking.
Well, you mentioned grandkids, you mentioned teenagers. So now and I'm sure a lot of people want to know, how can we introduce spirituality or meditation to young people who might be resistant to spirituality or meditation?
Very simply, you don't overcomplicate it. And I train thousands of people every year in EFT acupressure, and we train a lot of therapists, a lot of doctors, a lot of nurses, a lot of both mental health and medical professionals, and many of them work with children. And when you work with children, you work really simply. One simple form of mindfulness and emotional regulation is to breathe. And 300 years ago, Benjamin Franklin said, if you're angry or annoyed, take 10 deep breaths.
Yeah.
And if you're really angry or annoyed, take 100.
Yeah.
My great guru, Ben Franklin. So, there he is, same advice as the Eastern teachers. And just breathing tells you you're safe because if you breathe, you're assuring your body giving a physiological signal that you are not under attack from a predator. And so if your thought is the predator, if you're thinking about a negative event and you then breathe, that by itself can break the association between that negative thought and going into fight or flight. Now, the caveat here is that's a good initial thing to do is to breathe. We did one randomized controlled trial comparing diaphragmatic breathing to tapping. And we found that both of them reduced triggering equally. Both of them reduced
Hmm.
anxiety equally. But after 6 months, the breathing group went back up, the tapping group flattened out.
Hmm.
So breathing is a really good immediate action to take, and you can teach it to kids. I'm just so thrilled. There's tapping in a lot of school systems now. There's mindfulness in a lot of school systems, and we are giving these kids ways to cope that I never had. I mean, I basically spent my whole life in school. It was just one level of a nightmarish hell or another. And I think back to, if I'd had this at 10, 12, 15 years old, how different my life would have been. Now, a lot of kids actually are getting it. In fact, we've had teams of volunteers through one of our nonprofit partners, going to places like Sandy Hook, Connecticut,
Wow.
and other Uvalde, Texas, and working with the survivors of those those school
Wow.
shootings, and those people's lives have been changed. We worked with other students, we worked with the siblings of kids who were killed, we worked with their parents, we worked with the community there. And I'm getting chills as I say this because there are so many people now with Sandy Hook, for example, whose lives are so transformed because they learned these simple stress reduction techniques, and their children now have them too.
That's great. And yeah, I think part of that is because now we are seeing, not just these spiritual experiences, which are important, but also the science starting to back it too. I mean, you've mentioned some of the findings. Any other like scientific findings that you found to be really compelling or interesting with your work?
uh, Cortisol. I did several of the very early pioneering clinical trials of cortisol around 20 years ago. And we were looking for ways to measure the effects of a therapy on cortisol quickly. And so we found that cortisol, with many of these stress reduction therapies, like tapping, like evidence-based meditation, they will drop cortisol really fast. In one study I did, and it's available through a journal called the Journal of Evidence-Based Integrative Medicine. We looked at people in a 1 week retreat who were meditating and tapping, and they were working on trauma. They were working on childhood trauma, like for 6 hours a day, and they were tapping on it. They were meditating in the morning. We found between day 1 and day 7, we found a 37% decrease in cortisol. A
Wow.
replication study found a 43% decrease in cortisol, massive reductions on permanent reductions in cortisol in just a week of these methods. So you want to, first of all, give yourself the benefit of that evidence-based meditation and then tapping to release stress short term. Tapping takes about a minute to do. So you get stressed about something, you tap. In 1 minute, usually your level of cortisol will start to drop,
Hmm.
your adrenaline starts to drop, and you lose your fight or flight focus that your body otherwise has. Those are basic techniques. There are many other evidence-based techniques, but make sure you use one that is grounded in science. Because I read stuff in on popular websites and blogs, and people have all kinds of ideas of stuff that worked for them. If it worked for somebody else, it may not work for you. You have a different history, different physiology, different worldview, different outlook, different training. And for example, some of us are highly visual, and so we get instructions to visualize this. Well, about a third of the population is not visual at all. They're
Yeah.
auditory, or they're somatically or kinesthetically based. And so they need totally different techniques from the visualizer. So it's important to find play around with stress reduction techniques, find ones that work for your unique body physiology and outlook.
I think that's great advice. And how about for those people, maybe they have been meditating for a while and they've found that it lowers their stress level, it keeps them more focused and calm throughout the day, but they're looking to take it to the next level and maybe experience that sense of oneness or bliss, and they haven't quite got to that point yet. should they even try to get to that point? Or I mean, if they want to, is there techniques to do it, or should they just, be happy with what they've got?
Persistence and sticking with it is necessary. I developed a form of meditation that combines all of these things, combines tapping with heart math, with neurofeedback, biofeedback, self-hypnosis, and it just takes
Hmm.
about 5 minutes to get there. And then people spend about 10 minutes in that state and then come out of it again. So the meditation cycle is about 15 minutes long. And it's called eco meditation, just because it stacks all of these evidence-based methods on top of each other. And it's very easy to learn. It's free all over the web. There are tons of people who've recorded eco meditation tracks besides me. So you can get it on apps like Insight Timer. You can get it free at ecomeditation.com. It's just all over the place. A lot of these big name coaches and gurus are using it themselves, or with sports teams, with high performing groups of people. And so you want to use something like that, and then you'll feel its effects in your body. People start to have those elevated experiences usually within the first 30 days,
Wow.
because the brain, under the influence of eco meditation and these evidence-based techniques, starts to produce a lot of oxytocin. And oxytocin triggers the production of a number of neurotransmitters. One of those is nitric oxide, which enlarges the blood vessels in the executive centers of the brain. But the main one is anandamide. And in researchers find enormous amounts of anandamide, especially in the brains of groups of people like Tibetan monks. And anandamide is named after the bliss molecule.
Oh,
It has the same chemical structure as THC, which is the active molecule in marijuana. It docks with the same receptive sites in the brain. So here we are flooding our brains with oxytocin, the love hormone, with anandamide, with beta endorphins, with serotonin, with dopamine. In meditators, dopamine can rise 65%. That's like
wow.
getting a shot of heroin. I mean,
Yeah.
you just feel so good. So you have this wonderful, delicious compound of all of these pleasure neurochemicals sloshing around in your brain. And we found that within 30 days, people basically become addicts. They can't stop. I talked to one woman, and she took because I say to people, okay, do it for 30 days. Just do it every day for 30 days and see what happens. I talked to one woman a few weeks ago. She said, I'm now over 1,000 days without missing a day. That's an addict.
That's great. And so I want to make sure I got that. That's ecomeditation.com. Is that the
Yeah.
website? And now is this a recording that you made or is
Yes.
oh wonderful. Um and you mentioned the hypnosis aspect. Is that integrated into the
Yes.
meditation?
That's
Okay.
just a very simple guided meditation. It takes again 15 minutes to go there. And
Okay.
also it has a grounding minute at the end because people do get way out there with it. And
Okay.
so you're asking, how do you get out there if you don't feel the bliss? And the chances are in 30 days of eco meditation, you will start to get much further out there. The problem we have with the people we coach in these techniques after like 3, 6, 9, 12 months is not getting out there, it's getting back down again. And that's why we have to start doing some serious integration with them because they
Right.
tend to be so far out there in samadhi that it's like the balloon at the end of the tether, and you have to really have to learn to ground yourself again because you can get so out there that you start to lose your interface with everyday reality. And so that's when there's another whole set of techniques required for integration.
And are these experiences and techniques, are these in your new book, Spiritual Intelligence?
Yes.
And yeah, tell
In
us a little more about that, or your book, Spiritual Intelligence.
Yeah, so spiritual intelligence, I mean, it's a fascinating thing. Like in the 90s, we suddenly became much more aware of emotional intelligence and that there was IQ. IQ is important, but we needed to be empathetic. We needed to connect with other people, and it produces health effects, produces better careers, much uh, different lifestyle choices, much greater job satisfaction. So EQ was really powerful. And now we're learning that SQ, spiritual intelligence, connects you with something greater than yourself. In one of the early SQ studies in the mid 1990s by a researcher named Kendall, he found that developing a relationship with something higher than yourself. Now again, you're getting out of your narcissistic cocoon, your preoccupation with I, me, mine. That part of the brain starts to shut down, get quiet. It's the default mode network. It's especially the mid prefrontal cortex right behind your eyes here. Highly active in people with major depressive disorder. I mentioned earlier that depression and spirituality are the same two sides of the same coin. They both use that mid prefrontal cortex. In people in depression, that part of the brain is highly active. People meditating, it gets very, very quiet. And now, as you quiet that part of the brain, we find that you develop this relationship with something greater than yourself. Your thoughts then move upward. You start to feel a sense of love, compassion, joy, gratitude, connection with that which is higher than yourself. And in those early studies, this is called relational spirituality because you have a relationship with the all that is. They found in one of the early ones that 94 genes were differentially expressed. So it's literally triggering different gene expression in your cells. Immunity genes get upregulated. Inflammation control genes get upregulated. Genes that help control cancer get upregulated. All kinds
Wow.
of beneficial things happen in your body when you are moving into these higher states of consciousness. So that's spiritual intelligence. And we need emotional intelligence. We desperately need spiritual intelligence and that connection with something greater than ourselves. And when we do that, that something greater than ourselves, the universe, God, the cosmos, whatever terminology you use for it, starts to then move and act through us. And when it finds human beings who are responsive and who are paying attention to it, who are meditating, who are connecting with it every day, then it starts to flow through us.
Yeah.
And then we find both our internal state changing, we become way happier, way more joyful. We start to move to those states of ecstasy, and then we find the world outside of ourselves changing. My wife says to me, Dawson, I love when you meditate. And she does because I'm a nicer person when I do.
That's so true. Yeah. That's great. And yeah, you literally talk about flowing through us, which made me think of another topic that you've written about, getting into the flow state.
Yes.
I mean, can you talk a little bit about that, how we can get into that flow state and what that looks like?
Yeah, and this was a discovery made by a group of neuroscientists starting in the 60s, and they were hooking up spiritual masters, adepts, to EEGs, and they were finding that they had this brainwave pattern, and they called it the awakened mind pattern. But then they began to hook up people in the 70s and 80s who were not spiritual, they weren't spiritual masters, weren't meditation teachers, weren't Qigong masters. What they were was they were high performers, high performing scientists, virtuoso musicians, Olympic athletes, brilliant business people. And they found that same pattern, the awakened mind
Interesting.
pattern. And the word for that state of just being in harmony with the all it is flow. And so the spiritual version is that sense of integrative connection with the all it is, with cosmic consciousness. The secular version is flow. And so meditation helps prime your day for flow, but you move into your day, and we find that people are extraordinarily more creative, more productive, and more resilient. In one recent study I published in a journal called Advances in Mind Body Medicine, we looked at people doing eco meditation for a month. We found that after a month, they were 20% more productive at their jobs, in their families, in their everyday life than they were before. 20%. That's like getting an extra day every week in your
Wow.
week. Yeah, I mean it was amazing, and they were even more productive 6 months later. So it's powerful to do these kinds of practices. They don't just transform your inner landscape to make you feel happier. They have this transformative effect on your outer life as well.
Yeah, I mean, these are all very powerful techniques. I feel like we could talk for hours about each of them. But I just want to check in with you. I mean, is there any topic that we haven't covered that you feel like we should talk about or go into more detail about any of these?
That's a good question, Matt. And one of the things that I that um, bothers me is that most people are so constrained in what they're allowing through them and the life they're living. And I hear people spouting self-limiting statements. I'm no good with money. All my relationships end in disaster. I'm no good at math. Like I have no sense of direction, blah, blah, blah. I mean, they tell themselves stories of limitation, and they're just not true. They're just old stories from their childhood, usually, that they're regurgitating now and turning into reality in their adult lives. And we live lives, we human beings are meant to live magnificent lives of utter joy. I mean, we look at, for example, a brainwave called gamma in the brains of these monks and nuns. And they start meditating, and we measure their gamma, and their gamma is 25 times that of the average human being.
Wow.
Their ecstasy, their level of gratitude and joy and contentment is 25x that of the average person, but we all have the same brain circuits. In my book, Spiritual Intelligence, I describe the research into these brain circuits. There are four of these circuits. Together, they combine in a potent network called the Enlightenment Network, which is active in meditation and which is shut down by stress. And so when we go into stress, we go into having small lives. We literally shut down our Enlightenment Network. We don't experience the ecstasy that we're meant to. But when you try, when you commit to meditation, when you try and turn it on every single day, it's like going to the gym every day. You're working out these
Right.
muscles, your biceps, your triceps, your deltoids, and you can bench press and do all these exercises and lift far more weights. When you're exercising those bundles of neurons in your brain that are to do with attention and ecstasy and joy and compassion, those parts grow quickly. Some parts of those of your brain are growing by 10% a month. They're doubling in size within a few months. And so now you have a way happier brain. So what really bothers me is most people accept a story of their lives that tells them they're small and limited and they get this much joy and no more. And they're living in this little box of limitation their whole lives. And we are meant to dance through our lives. We're meant to be joyful every day. We're meant to scream and yell and sing and dance. Babies laugh 300 times a day.
I know.
Adults
Yeah.
laugh about 20 times a day. We shut ourselves down during our lives. And like I'm on a mission through spiritual intelligence and bliss brain to just tell people, hey, come out of that limited self. You are a magnificent expression of the universe. Rumi says, you are not a drop of the cosmic universe. You are the cosmic universe in a drop. And it's time for us to live that way every single moment of every day.
I I agree wholeheartedly. I also, like I said, I work as a psychologist, so I'm always curious, like, what do you say with to people who have those limited beliefs and they may have just genuine stressors coming down with them. Maybe they're in a work environment that's a toxic work environment, or they're in a relationship with a partner that's very unhealthy, or they're not being treated well. So yes, meditation can help, but they have these environmental factors that are really, really causing them stress. I mean, what do you say to people in situations like that?
There are actual bad situations. Like last week, I was presenting to a group of psychologists in Kiev, Ukraine, via
Wow.
Zoom link. And there's a group of psychologists that are treating
Wow.
people with terrible PTSD in Ukraine, and we're training them to use tapping
Good for
with
you.
those victims of the war in Ukraine. This is not imaginary. This is not mindset. This is, like we had one meeting that had to be canceled because bombs fell on the building next door and killed people. So, I mean, this isn't like, this is real world stuff. If you're being abused in a relationship, if you're in an abusive job, then you have to address those external factors as well as the internal ones. But start with the internal ones. If you get a diagnosis of a disease, if you get diagnosed with a disease, especially an autoimmune disease or a lifestyle disease, ask, what can I do? Even if you are in a toxic relationship, say, what can I do right now
Yeah.
to shift my perspective? And I've known several people who are spiritual masters who are in marriages with other people who are not, and yet they manage, even in that unpromising environment, to shine. I know people who work in stores who, I mean, there's one woman who works in a grocery store near where I live, where I buy groceries, and it's just a grocery store. It's not an ashram, it's not a spiritually uplifting environment necessarily, but she just looks into people's eyes, she smiles, she greets them. She's an angel, and she's
Yeah.
just being that person in that very neutral environment. And if you're, again, if you're in a toxic relationship, if you're in a toxic workplace, if there's some actual stuff happening there, deal with it. The Buddha said, if you're struck, Buddha said, if you're struck by a poisoned arrow, don't sit down cross-legged and meditate. Pull out the arrow. So you deal with the arrow and then you deal with your stuff. Now, what I will say is that it changes your view of outside reality. I was lecturing at a university this last weekend. They just invited me to do a guest weekend there as a lecturer and train some of their people. And they had me at a hotel, staying in a hotel, and the hotel had bicycles. And I got there a few hours early, and I asked the hotel if I could borrow a bike, and went on a bike ride. And when I was crossing one intersection, there was a woman there on her cell phone, and she just got wrapped up in her cell phone, and other cars began to stack up behind her. And they were pretty mad at her. Eventually, someone started to honk their horn. Then there were a whole bunch of people honking. And this woman leaned out of her window, gave everyone the finger,
Oh, wow.
and screamed obscenities at me, as the bicyclist, at all the other drivers. I mean, she was just screaming like a maniac.
Jeez.
So there I am. There's this person screaming at me. I'm cycling by. And well, first of all, I pedaled rather fast to get out of her range. So that was me avoiding the arrows. But then I just thought, Matt, she is suffering so terribly only out of a nightmare hell internally does somebody act that way toward other human beings.
Yeah.
And what you find happens is that maybe you have this miserable boss or this miserable spouse, and after a while you move into compassion with them. Does it mean you tolerate their abusive behavior? No, you draw a line and you say, this is my boundary. You have clear and healthy boundaries. But you realize that the people who are the warmongers, who are the hate mongers in our society, are those most deserving of our compassion. They are
Yeah.
suffering worse than the misery they're creating in the lives of other people. And you realize that they are living in hell. So, what you want to do is make sure you're living in heaven and then have compassion on those people who are living in hell. And what I talk about in the last chapter of my book, Spiritual Intelligence, is how the world is really separating into two groups. This is shown in a bunch of recent scientific surveys. The people who are living in heaven are having a more and more and more elevated experience of the world. The people who are living in hell are having a more and more hellish experience of the world, and the two groups are actually diverging. And that's what the last 20 years of
Mm.
surveys shows us. So be one of those people who lives in heaven. Have compassion on those around you, but we all live in the same world. You may as well make it a wonderful place for yourself to be in personally.
That's a really wise way of looking at things. And I appreciate you addressing like all sides of humanity and for coming up with a very helpful way of looking at things. Um, this has been a fascinating conversation. But thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. If people want to learn more about you or read your books or get in touch with you, what's the best way that people can learn more about you and your work?
Matt, the best way for people to learn more about my work is to go to the website Dawson, just my name, Dawson, DawsonGift.com, DawsonGift.com, and you can get a free meditation track there. That's the one I want you to become an addict of. So it's
Okay.
going to unlock that anandamide and serotonin and dopamine in your brain. So go to DawsonGift.com, download the free meditation there, and there's also a free manual for that acupressure tapping method there. And so get those two free things, use the tapping for stress reduction, do 30 days with that meditation. I only need you for 30 days. If you can stop after 30 days, great. If you're still doing it after 1,000 days, you're another addict to your own joy and your own pleasure neurochemicals. So go to dawsongift.com, download the meditation, grab the manual, look for a practitioner in our practitioner listings there. We have hundreds of certified clinical EFT practitioners on the site, and they are trained both in trauma and also in bringing people to elevated states of peak awareness. And have somebody in your pocket, some resource like that of a practitioner who's able to help you through areas you can't deal with yourself. For example, you don't want to, if you have severe trauma, complex PTSD, please, it's not self-help. You need a qualified mental health professional to help you with that. So we recommend, we say, by all means, go tap on things you can tap on and meditate on things you can meditate on. If you have a serious long-term issue, get good medical advice, get good psychological help, and have that as well. All of these things are there for our well-being. It's not either or. It's not either we're using energy therapies or we're using conventional medicine. You need the best of all these worlds. And so you'll find links on dawsongift.com to our certified practitioners, our online classes, virtual events, live events. There are all kinds of resources there. Browse around and go have fun. Go play.
Well, thank you. That's a very generous offering and gift. So yeah, I would definitely encourage people to go there. And thank you again for sharing your joy, sharing your wisdom. It's been an absolute pleasure and honor to speak with you tonight.
Matt, it's been fun, and thank you for all you do to promote awareness of these wonderful healing gifts that we all have at our fingertips. It's been a real joy to join you here.
Oh, thank you. I'm honored.